Minister, are you dealing with it? No. Well, we need a minister. It appears to, is it Deputy Doherty or Deputy Clare Curran? Okay, Deputy Curran, the floor is yours. You have 20 minutes. Ceann Comhairle, when it comes to many of the issues of the day, sometimes with all of the data and the percentages, the actual lived reality can sometimes be missed. I have engaged with many people ahead of this motion here this evening, both online and in person. A mother who gets up in the middle of the night to refill her little boy's hot water bottles because they cannot afford to buy oil. A nursing student commuting daily for college, having to miss days as she can't afford to fill her car for 5 days of the week. A working couple who will have to decide next month whether to make their mortgage payment or to get a fill of oil. A worker in the oil industry telling me how older people are crying on the phone, wondering how they will keep paying for coal. This is not make-believe. The CEO of Allowance, an organisation which advocates for older people, has said that older people are choosing between heating and eating. Someone's mother, someone's father, their granny, their granddad, deciding whether they should buy fuel or buy food. And imagine that that is a decision to be made by older people living in our state in 2022. The Society of St Vincent de Paul have seen a 49% increase in calls in February of this year compared to the same time last year. People ringing them seeking help with energy costs. So you don't have to listen to Sinn Féin or indeed other members of the opposition in this House. You could just listen to the people that are out there, to the workers, to the families, to the organisations like the Society of St Vincent de Paul, who are spending millions every year helping people with energy costs. This is now the reality for workers and for families right across the state. Just last week, Bord Gáis announced unprecedented increases in electricity and gas. They're increases that will kick in just a couple of weeks' time. They will see gas bills increase by €340 a year and electricity by €350. And this price hike follows over 40 price hikes that we've seen from energy providers in the last year. Almost, and coming up to 40 indeed. Home heating oil, which many of the people I represent in Roscommon and Galway rely on to heat their homes, has doubled in the last year. And carbon tax, which your government will increase, kicking in on the 1st of May, will further increase gas and oil prices at a time when many households are spending more on their bills than they ever have before. We also know that coal is up 50% since September last year, and further increases are expected next month. And again, we see up to now, at every point when we've raised the issue of the cost of living crisis and particularly the energy prices, and again we see it in your amendment here this evening, you speak about the budget last year and you speak about the social welfare increases, which are more or less now irrelevant given where we are now compared to where we were last October. Of course, those increases in social welfare came when we had 2 years previous with no increases whatsoever, and we are also at a point where every single working age weekly social welfare payment is already set below the poverty line and well below it. And you speak of those increases like you speak about the fuel allowance as if you were doing people a favour, when the reality is we have entire cohorts of people, those relying on social welfare like lone parents, like carers, like persons with a disability, and then you have also entire cohorts of workers who are getting up early in the morning, paying their taxes, and these people are not able to cover their basic costs week to week. The government have also overemphasised the fuel allowance. It's still not back up to 32 weeks, which Fine Gael cut back back in 2012. Again, many households are locked out of the fuel allowance. This is a point we have made repeatedly. Those out sick from work on the illness benefit can't access the fuel allowance. Those on low wages relying on the working family payment, they can't access the fuel allowance either. Nor can many older people who have a small occupational pension, they don't get the fuel allowance either. And then the exceptional needs payment is cited as an additional support for those who might be struggling with their fuel costs. But what's not said when the government bring that forward as a suggestion is that if you work 30 hours or more a week, you cannot get the exceptional needs payment. And that means we are leaving entire cohorts of workers, people who are paying their taxes and working, unable to afford, struggling and mounting increasing fuel bills every single week and month. That's not mentioned in your amendment, the exceptional needs payment, which is a wonder. And I would also say there are measures brought forward in this motion in relation to social protection that can and should be taken by this government to give people the assistance they need.
Deputy. Now we have Deputy Doherty, Deputy Conway Walsh, Deputy Farrell, Deputy Daly and Deputy Andrews.
The Irish people are in the grips of a cost of living crisis, and as we all know, in the past month, as a consequence of the illegal invasion by Russia of Ukraine, energy prices have soared, and the impact of the conflict has also led to spiralling commodity prices, with the prices of wheat, fertiliser and other industrial inputs all rising sharply. And in the current context, it's easy to forget that the cost of living crisis predates this conflict, with rents and energy prices both rising with terrible consequences for renters, for workers and for families. And we're seeing what I believe is a very deliberate narrative shift that says that the entire cost of living crisis has been caused by the invasion of Ukraine, and that all of us must make sacrifices and bear the cost. And that simply isn't true, and it needs to be challenged, because the cost of living crisis predates this conflict, as does the government's failure to respond to it. In December, prices had risen by 5.7%, with energy prices up 27% and home heat and oil up 53%. As a result, even then, core social welfare rates, as has been mentioned by Deputy Curran, had been cut in real terms, impacting the most vulnerable in our society. And the government rejected Sinn Féin's request that they respond. And I have said so before, the cost of price rises will not be borne by everyone equally. As always, low and middle income households will bear the greatest costs in all of this, with the wealthiest being bearing the least unless action is taken. So inflation hits those on lower incomes hardest. As a proportion of your income, the lowest income households spend 3 times more on fuel and energy than does the top 10%. So workers and families are facing difficult choices. Their incomes are being squeezed, their pockets are burned. And we have had more than 30 price increases announced in the past year by energy providers, with Bord Gáis announcing last week that it was hiking prices again by 39%, and more price hikes are expected in the months ahead. And again, the narrative from government is this is a result of the war in Ukraine, but gas is bought in the international market months in advance. These price hikes announced by Bord Gáis and likely other utilities is because of the spike that took place last year, and we will see further likely increases as gas that's been bought now will be consumed by consumers at the later end of the year, and those prices passed on, which will be the large increases that have happened as a result of the invasion of Ukraine. Home heat and oil has increased by €600 for 1,000 litres since the start of the year. Since the start of the year alone, €600. And the response from government, what has it been? It's been bizarre. Last week, the Minister for Finance ruled out any measure to support low and middle-income households until October. And separately, we have a government party knowingly spreading disinformation online and on the airwaves by falsely claiming that it could not reduce excise on home heat and oil and support households when in fact it could. And it's a pity that Minister Colin Brophy has left the chamber, because this would be an opportunity for him to withdraw his accusations against me that I was lying on the national airwaves when I claimed that there was excise duty on home heat and oil, because I'm sure he read the journal's Facts Find and the comment from the Department of Finance and from Revenue to clarify that Sinn Féin are right and the government are wrong in this regard. And none of that means much to people What they want is they want the cost driven down, and this shows that there could be further action taken from government. We have a Green Party leader telling people to slow down, while another minister has told us, sitting across the table or across the floor here, to stop complaining and to shop around. And that's the arrogance that we're getting from a government that is out of touch when people are really, really suffering. So I'm asking the government to wake up to the cost of living crisis that workers and families are suffering, and to support them. And that's what this motion does, Minister. It is to start by removing excise duty on home heating oil to support families who are struggling to heat their homes. And this alone would reduce the cost of a fill by €100, to move as far as it can on the cost of diesel and petrol, with further reductions on excise duty, and to win a special derogation to reduce the level of VAT applied to household energy bills. Sinn Féin have been calling on the government to negotiate with the Commission on this issue since September of last year, and on each occasion the government has ruled it out. So I welcome the fact that in the last 2 weeks you have started to deal with this issue, and what is also needed is targeted supports, and that's why we're proposing cost of living cash payments at a rate of €200 for individuals with incomes below €30,000 and €100 for individuals with incomes between €30,000 and €60,000. My colleague has mentioned the suite of measures we need from the Department of Social Protection to protect those most vulnerable. This motion is a call to action, and I ask those on all sides of the House to respond and support the workers and families who are greatly in need at this time.
Deputy Rose Conway-Walsh.
Minister, I welcome the opportunity to speak on this motion, not least because I come from an area of the country with one of the highest fuel poverties that exists in Mayo and North Mayo. Minister, the fact is that you're not doing enough. You see, I saw Mary Lou MacDonald question on Taoiseach today, and got no response again from him. You see people looking at that, people who are really struggling and juggling in trying to pay their bills. That is no good to them. That absolutely infuriates them. And the reason it does is that they are bearing the burden for this. The cost of fuel and the energy cost permeates right through all economic transactions, with the cost bearing heavily down on the shoulders of ordinary workers and families. And that is a fact. And Minister, you need to get government, and you need to listen. You need to know what people are struggling with at the moment. You need to listen to St Vincent de Paul. You need to listen to the people who are missing hospital appointments because they cannot afford to put fuel in the car. We told you that you could go further in terms of diesel, in terms of petrol, and in terms of home heating oil. You can go further than this, and you know that you can. The argument last week over excise duty on home heating oil was absolutely bizarre in the least, when you had revenue come out to very clearly say that excise duty was on energy. Also, the fact, you see, that you're putting carbon tax on it, you're not only saying to people, you've got to just suck it up, you're saying we're going to put a further tax on your carbon tax. When you have, and then you present retrofitting, and we very much welcome retrofitting, but you present that as being the solution. But for the Warmer Home Scheme in our area, there's a 2-year waiting list. You know, it is not dealing with the crisis right here, right now, where people cannot afford to live. They can barely afford to survive. And we must do everything, and you as a government must do everything possible to alleviate the burden that's on ordinary workers and families.
Tásan na fadan lá bhfuil daoine ag folann smiáil ar an ordú olmhór tá take ar an gustas marachtála. Bhí is aine sin féinar nui go mbeadh an ráta bailscithe ag ordú le há-oscailt an tochaí, ach beléir nach raibh an fis céin ag an rialtas nar cheangail siad price císa leis an ráta bailscithe. Ar nui tá sé héistal in a bheas marall ar an goga san Úcrain, ach caithe muid a bheith ionrach fi seo. Bhí géir chéim sa chustas marachtála ribh is seo ar fad. Bhí na císa is orda an san Eorop, agus bhí costas chomh leanaí cost le price morgosta. O taide o Social Justice Ireland beléir gur beag nach cúgu de riine fásta ina gcónaí imachtanas nor choirtar méid airgad atá a chahabh acab chís. Ach anis a ara tá sé ina phráiseach omláin. Tasíonn cabhar waidíne. Caithfar gar siar an tlachtháil ar olabália, caithfar gar siar ar petrol agus ar diesel, caithfar níos múdaí na hang se steas lúntas brosla, agus tasíonn ciste lá
lán ránach a bhhanú chun cabharthóir scóp siúd a táfaí bhrú uasach agus nachhfuil an an íoc as a gcuid billy. Sin é an chinál gníomh atá ag tastal mhaith na nína ón rialtas. Ara, the cost of living crisis had sadly hit us long before the war in Ukraine, and we already had completely unaffordable rents, childcare that's like a second mortgage, and we were the fourth most expensive EU country for electricity. Social Justice Ireland told us before Christmas that almost 1/5 of adults were living in poverty when you include housing costs. And this was the crisis point before the war, and now it is completely unmanageable for so many people to keep the lights on, keep the house warm and have food on the table. People need targeted supports right now to help them through this extremely difficult time, and it is high time that the fuel allowance is extended to those on the working family payment, and we need a discretionary fund so that those people who don't get the fuel allowance and who are in absolute crisis, that they can avail of it. Minister, we are unfortunately living in extraordinary times, and we need a response from government that reflects that.
Yesterday I was in my local butcher's shop, Minister, and the conversation was not about Kerry's win over Armagh. It wasn't about where the ministers were on holidays. It was about the struggle that the people who are buying their meat at the counter were dealing with every single day. Having spoken to the owner of the butcher shop today, a drum of oil is up 33%. The price of chicken has doubled. The price of lamb is up 50%. And the price of breading and packaging and butter is up 30%. Now, we're not here to speak about the price in the butcher shop, but it's all as a result of the increase, or one of the main factors, the increase in energy prices. Kerry is a county which has been heavily affected by the current rise in fuel costs, which will no doubt continue to rise. It doesn't seem to be any end in sight. The invasion of Ukraine obviously hasn't helped, but inflation across the board has been a long time coming as a result of policies going back over a decade, fully endorsed and pursued by members of this government. If we go back to 2013, we in Sinn Féin called on the government not to sell Bord Gáis to Centrica for the knockdown price of for that section of it of 129 million. In the last 3 years, the profits of Centrica for Bord Gáis has been 50 million, 33.5 million and 55 million. Not a bad price to be getting for it. My county has a high degree of peripherality. It has a poor public transport network and a lot of isolated and rural areas. We are even more affected by the increase in energy prices as a result of the policies of this government. This morning, in the Leader's questions, the government said that it can't control what is happening on the world stage. It can't control it, but it can react to it. And what I'm asking you to do today, Minister, is to take the steps to react to it and make the burden easier for the people who are standing at the butcher's counter, for the people who were going to buy 3 breasts of chicken but would left the shop with only 1 because they couldn't afford numbers 2 and 3. That's the type of crisis we've heard. I could list out all of the various increases, Bord Gáis and the price of coal and all of that, but that's what you're down to, people eating less than they would normally do, not being able to budget towards the end of the week. That's what they are stuck with as a result directly of the government not reacting and the policies of this government going back over a decade. What we are calling for is a cost of living cash payment, reducing excise duty on petrol and diesel, getting a derogation to reduce VAT, the extension of the fuel allowance, and when it is reduced, I see that people in CE schemes who are trying to get work can't get it in a lump sum to pay their fuel costs. So I want you to try and deal with that as well, and a discretionary fund of also 15 million to assist those households.
Chris Andrews.
I welcome the opportunity to speak on this motion. This motion in reality reflects people's everyday circumstances, and the rising cost of living is being felt across the whole community, whether you're in Ringsend or Donnybrook or Kimmage or Kevin Street. It's the first thing that people are raising with me. People are fighting, have to decide between heating are eating, and that's, it's something that is a huge concern to everybody in this House, and everyone is feeling the pressure of these rising costs. Recent research from Red Sea on behalf of St Vincent de Paul found that 30% of people have had to cut back on essential heating and electricity costs. Nearly 20% have had to cut back on essential food costs, and we know who feels these sharp increases in the cost of living most, and it's the low and middle income workers and their families who are hit hardest. These households must spend a higher proportion of their income on food and fuel, and week after week they are left with less and less of their disposable income. This is having a devastating impact on inner city communities across Dublin. This rising cost of living and the housing crisis are ripping these communities apart. For so many, these rising costs are making the hope of owning a home or renting within their community seem impossible. The rising cost of renting swallows a large chunk of most people's salaries, and many people feel suffocated by all these rising costs. This devastates local communities, families and couples who simply want to settle down and start a family. So many of these young people are being forced out of their community in search of housing. We need to see a meaningful suite of measures being put in place to ease the burden on people. This motion brings forward a wide range of measures aimed at easing that burden and giving households much needed support and a break. It includes a cost of living payment of €200 for adults on an income of less than 30,000 and 100 for those on between 30 and 60,000 per year. Further reductions in excise duty on petrol and diesel, and the removal of excise duty on home heating oil for a temporary period. That is what is needed, and I support this motion.
Thank you very much, Deputy. Now we go back to Sinn Féin, where Deputy Munster is sharing with Deputies Ellis, Cronin and Crowe.
Thanks, Ceann Corley. Minister, the astronomical increase in fuel costs have pushed hundreds of thousands of Irish households to the brink, and the statistics laid out in this motion are quite shocking. We've had more than 30 different price increases from energy suppliers in the last year, and costs have risen by around €500 per average household. Home heating oil has increased by over €600 for 1,000 litres this year. Coal has increased by €4.50 per bag last week, and we're expecting major increases in the coming weeks and months. Next month alone, gas will increase by 30% and coal by a further €2.50 a bag. And these figures mean one thing for low and middle income families. It means hardship and the real risk of poverty. And we know that up to 475,000 households in Ireland are at risk of energy poverty. In January, 37% of people reported having to cut back on essential heating and electricity use, and we know that that figure is much higher by now. And I'm not sure if the government fully appreciate the pressures that families are under, including those who have no choice but to use their own cars and are struggling to keep them on the road. There are no supports available to most people to cope with this. The once-off payment from government is unfortunately a drop in the ocean when compared to the cost of energy. The measure to reduce excise duty doesn't include home heating, as we all know. The measure to extend fuel allowance will only benefit those who are already qualified for the payment. And the exceptional needs allowance has been put forward by yourselves as a solution, yet it doesn't apply to anyone working more than 30 hours a week. This motion, Minister, has put forward a number of simple, practical measures that will help ease the burden for people. And I hope that this time round you and your government will listen, that you'll plan and act to help families through this very difficult time. And I appreciate that you have introduced some measures, but you're simply not doing enough. And you've heard that from everybody in this chamber today. And what you need to do is act now, plan to bring in measures over the forthcoming months to ease the burden on families and working people. And the question is, are you prepared to do that or to turn a blind eye to it?
My constituency of Dublin North West has a substantial number of houses and estates. that were built from the 50s onwards. These older buildings are difficult and expensive to heat. Much of the heat escapes through the walls, roofs and chimneys. There are thousands of such homes across the country that need to be fully insulated to be energy efficient. This will help to lower household spend on fuel to heat the house and make the houses more energy efficient. This can be done by insulating attics, fitting heat pumps, doing wraparounds, pumping insulation into walls or changing windows and doors where necessary in order to bring the houses up to an acceptable energy rating standard. Without such work, these houses can be very cold. Many are inhabited by senior citizens who are very vulnerable to the cold and can ill afford to pay from their small incomes for domestic fuel or gas to keep their house warm. For those dependent primarily on domestic fuel to heat their house, they will have seen an eye-watering rise in price per litre from 43 cents per litre in Dublin only 18 months ago to 176 cents per litre at its peak this month. That's an over 300% increase in domestic fuel costs in Dublin in this short period of time. This is just not sustainable for many families and pensioners. They are left with a terrible dilemma in having to make choices based on their limited incomes and the rising cost of living and the cost of domestic fuel and electricity. Is it not a cliche to say that they have to make a decision as to whether they can heat their house or put food on the table? As the cost of domestic fuel has become so prohibitive, many people are reverting back to using coal fires. This is not an efficient way to heat a house, nor is it cost effective, as so much of the heat is lost up the chimney. Our motion tonight lays out a number of solutions which would mitigate against the worst of the extortionate fuel costs on households. For those families, and especially for senior citizens who are dependent on cars, the government should consider an additional reduction in excise duty on diesel and petrol, as well as its removal from domestic fuel, even if only on a temporary basis to give families some breathing space. Families on low incomes and in receipt of the working family payment should be eligible for the fuel allowance. Families are being hit hard now and will need extra supports to ease the burdens they face each day with the rising cost of living and the escalating energy costs. Thank you.
Deputy Cronin.
Carla. When it comes to energy, we certainly are in a state of emergency, and it's an emergency that's affecting people's health. I made the most of the fact that we didn't have late night sittings last week and spent most of my evenings knocking doors in my constituency in North Kildare. And people are telling me that their palms are sweating when they go to fill up the car, that their chests are tightening when the kids are asking them to put on the heating because they're freezing. Others are telling me that they feel nauseous when they hear the electricity bills and the gas bills popping through the letterbox. These are people who get up very early in the morning, either to work or to care in the home. A constituent told me that they're borrowing from family at the end of the month to go to work because they can't afford to fill the car. Over €90 a week to fill their car to go to work. And in constituencies like North Kildare, where there's not a lot of public transport, prices like that, it's not unusual. Others have told me that they're actively looking to work from home, not just because of COVID, but because of fuel costs. These prices are crucifying people financially, and they're having a knock-on impact on their health and stress levels in the family. The House already knows what we're proposing here to rein in the costs, including removing excise duty on home heating for this period. And I'm very glad that the Revenue Commissioners cleared this up with the public and corrected the government representatives that thought they were smart, pushing their mushy political spin instead of the financial facts. And indeed, there should be more than one Fine Gael apology coming Deputy Doherty's way today. As a member of the Climate Committee, I'm watching our north and south poles going through extreme heat waves this week. I'm well aware of the climate emergency we were in, but I wanted to make the Sinn Féin position on carbon tax very clear because, as my father used to say, some people need to be told every day. Right now, ordinary people simply don't have a choice. The alternative options are not there. To increase carbon tax for them now is punitive. It's like slapping a sugar tax on the weekly shop when the only food in the shop is cakes, sweets or donuts. And we simply must do better. And we absolutely are in a climate emergency, and we want to be getting on with providing affordable alternatives for our people.
Good morning, Carla. I suppose the question we're all putting tonight is that are you doing enough, Minister? I've read your speech. You know, you're saying you're aware of the challenges that's facing families. Then you go on to outline some of the issues that, you know, some of the measures that you're talking about introducing, and you're basically contending then that you've done enough. Well, on this side of the House, we believe, and you know what we're picking up off people and families and individuals is that you're not doing enough, and that they're suffering. And I suppose what we wanted to hear tonight is not what you can't do, and you outlined clearly you can't do a lot of things because of, you know, your hands are tied, and but we wanted to hear what you can do. And I didn't hear anything tonight that said that you're going to do anything differently. And that's I suppose that's the nub of the matter. You're not doing enough, and clearly you're not going to do any more. And if you are, you have an outline in your speech that you're going to do more. You know that oil prices are rising. Even during last week's drop, they were still higher than any point in the last 8 years. Have you took that on board when you're making your decisions, Minister? There are almost weekly announcements now from price rises from different providers, consumers, and people have nowhere to turn. And my contention is that there are currently no supports for the vast majority of workers and families to assist with the rising heating costs. And that'd be the view of most people that I've talked to. And home heating oil has increased in price by over €1,000 for 1,000 litres in 1 year. Like how are people supposed to keep up with that, Minister? So, you know, people have talked in terms of the carbon tax. Where is the just transition, Minister? Implementing a carbon tax in the current circumstances is simply kicking people when they're down on the ground. It'll only add to crippling energy prices and put further pressure on families. So, Minister, the government needs to reduce excise duty on petrol and diesel and secure an agreement in Europe so they can reduce VAT on bills. Workers and families need help now, Minister, not down the road. They can't afford to wait for grandiose plans and lofty notions to come to fruition. So, Minister, the question is, are you doing enough? And I'm arguing that you're not.
Thank you very much, Cian Corla. I have to say, Minister, that's an incredibly disappointing and disingenuous response. The one thing you've said, which I agree with, is you have at least admitted the government isn't doing enough. And of course, we don't need you to tell us that, because ordinary working families across the state know that. But nobody on this side of the benches is telling you to do everything. We just want you to do more. And the reason why we're asking you to do more is because every single day in our constituencies, as I'm sure in yours and Minister Humphreys, working families and small businesses are urging you to do more. You're a constituency politician, as is the Minister beside you. I know you talk to your constituents every day, as I do. And they are telling us, collectively in this House, that more needs to be done. And they are only too aware of the fact that it is their taxes that fund the public services or any additional temporary relief that this government provides them with. I also have to say, Minister, it is a bit rich for you to talk about honesty, when last week, when Sinn Féin first started to outline the types of measures that are in this motion today, we were told by government that it wasn't possible, that it wasn't legal, even though Deputy Curran and Deputy Doherty and Mary Lou MacDonald outlined how was the case. In fact, probably the most dishonest contribution to this entire public debate has been a Fine Gael tweet that claimed there was no excise duty on home heating oil. And of course, Minister Donoghue knows, because the officials in his own department as well as Revenue confirmed to the journal.ie fact check that in fact that's not the case. Carbon tax is a form of excise duty. The Minister knows, but at least tonight he's honest enough to make the argument it's about cost and not about legality. And the problem is this: the measures taken to date, both the measures that were outlined in the budget, which weren't enough to deal with the rising cost of living at that stage, or the measures that were taken a week and a half ago, are not doing enough to constrain the rising cost of fuel. And until I hear a government minister on the other side accepting that and putting forward some other alternative, we will keep coming back again and again and again to make these proposals. So, Minister, you do yourself no service repeating some of the questionable arguments that I've heard from government benches to date. I have to say I thought you were better than that. At least Minister Ryan was honest with us in his contributions last week. But we're imploring you, listen to what not we're saying, but what the people you represent are saying, and come back and do more. Because if you don't, people are going to suffer in homes, in businesses, in families, and certainly we won't be party to that.
Cahirlock, Deputy O'Brien rightly described the Minister's remarks as disingenuous. I would go further to say that, if anything, they came across as disinterested in the realities that are facing many of the people that we all represent. And it's not surprising, unfortunately, because from time to time we've heard the real inclinations of a government that is quite simply out of touch. From a Fianna Fáil minister telling people to shop around, to a Green Party leader telling us to drive slower, to a Fine Gael finance minister who tonight essentially has confirmed that he has no intention of doing anything further. In fact, the next measure that this government will implement in relation to the cost of living crisis is to increase those costs further through an additional hike in the carbon tax in May. This is not fair, and it is not fair on those ordinary people who are asking themselves consistently what this government has actually delivered to alleviate the increased prices that they're bearing on essential heating, travel and electricity costs, but largely coming up blank. We're a food-producing nation. We're an affluent state. It is not good enough that families with 2 earning workers have to make the stark choice, as they do today, as to whether or not they eat or heat their homes. They have to keep one eye, and you know people who are in this position, I'm sure, Minister, certainly Minister Humphreys does, because they're her constituents as well as mine. They tell me of keeping an eye on the gauge as they travel home, holding their breath, hoping that they can make it, trying to get through today because they're actually afraid to even think about tomorrow. And for many of those same workers, there has never been a boom, just a bust. Many of those people, this government that has forced upon them the exorbitant rents or mortgage rates, the childcare costs and insurance premiums, is now, through its lack of support, actually leaving them with the choice as to how they can put food on the table. Sinn Féin have put forward proposals that will make things a little bit better. It won't resolve everything, because we understand that government can't do everything, but government can do much more. And I have to say it's shameful that government TDs are essentially going to vote through this week an amendment that proposes that precisely nothing additional is done to help those hard-pressed workers and families.
Thank you.
Minister, I'm really at a loss as to how the government's response to what you do call an energy crisis can be described as a comprehensive response. The main issue being debated here this evening, and the main issue raised by those that have spoken, is household heating costs. And you've said that the opposition wouldn't be content no matter what you've brought forward or what government proposal is brought forward, but there is no proposal. There is no proposal in relation to household heating. That is the problem. There is no proposal. Aside from the €200 electricity credit that was announced nearly 4 months ago that we're still waiting for, nothing has been brought forward to assist people with heating their homes. That is a fact. You have overemphasised time and time again the fuel allowance, but the vast majority of workers and households out there do not receive the fuel allowance. If you're out sick from work on illness benefit, you cannot get the fuel allowance. If you're on low income, relying on the working family payment to top up your low income, you cannot access the fuel allowance. If you're a couple or an older person with a small occupational pension, you do not get the fuel allowance. You've spoke a lot about energy efficiency, but again, energy efficiency and retrofitting is completely irrelevant for people today who cannot pay their bills. That is a fact. Your government have also overemphasised the exceptional needs payment, but what you haven't said every time you raise it is the fact that if you work 30 hours or more a week, you cannot access an exceptional needs payment. That means there is no assistance, no support for any worker out there that is working 30 hours or more a week. They have nothing, no help, no assistance, no support. They don't get the the fuel allowance, they don't get the exceptional needs payment, and that is the cohort of people that we are talking about in this motion primarily, and you have no proposals for them. I have raised the discretionary fund for 13 months now. It was February last year when I had brought that forward. The Society of St Vincent de Paul clearly don't think the exceptional needs payment fund is working either, otherwise they wouldn't be suggesting a discretionary fund. We need a fund for people, particularly those who cannot access the fuel allowance, to be able to assist them with utility debt in particular. This is something MABs have raised repeatedly, and this is something the Society of St Vincent de Paul have been calling for now for over a year. And if the exceptional needs payment that your government keeps pushing was actually working and doing its job, then we wouldn't need the discretionary fund, but clearly it isn't. We ask in our motion, particularly in relation to the fuel allowance, that it will be extended to those people who are receiving the working family payment. We have also asked that the fuel allowance will be extended for 2 additional weeks. We know the fuel allowance was cut by your party in 2012. It was at 32 weeks, it is now at 28, and it still has not been restored to what it was. I mentioned those people I have engaged with in the last week ahead of this motion. A mother who gets up in the middle of the night to refill her children's hot water bottles because they can't afford oil. A nursing student who's commuting daily for college, she has to miss days because she can't afford to fill her car to run for 5 days. A working couple who have to decide next month whether they make their mortgage payment or whether they get a fill of oil. A worker in the oil industry told me how older people are crying on the phone as to how they are going to afford coal when bags of coal continue to increase. And nothing you have said this evening, or nothing the Minister said earlier, or nothing in your amendment will actually assist or do anything for these people. And this is not make-believe. These are real people, real families. And again, if you don't want to listen to Sinn Féin and you don't want to listen to people on the opposition, you should listen to the people out there. You should listen to Alone, a huge organisation representing older people in this state for a very long time, who are telling us that older people are deciding between buying food and buying fuel in 2022. You should listen to the Society of St Vincent de Paul, who have seen an almost 50% increase in calls in February of this year compared to last year. People calling the Society of St Vincent de Paul looking for help with their energy costs. These are older people primarily. They're somebody's mother, father, granny, granddad. They're deciding between fuel and food. It shouldn't happen, but it is happening all of the time. And nothing you've said this evening is going to make a difference. And again, I will make the point, and you have said clearly, everything you do won't be enough. You have done nothing on home heating oil. And I would ask you again to look at it, to look at this motion and the proposals we have brought forward. I have the list of costings here if you'd like to see them. You should know we never bring forward any proposals without being fully costed. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy. Now, that concludes the debate. And I now must put the question. And there are amendments, number 1, number 2. Number 2 is taken first, is in the name of the Minister of Finance. And I now put the question. You have moved the amendment in the course of your speech, and I now put the question that the amendment be made. Nadini Heven Keston Abdish Tall. In the Guinea? I believe that the amendment is passed. Vote all. In the event of the vote, the vote will be determined tomorrow evening at the usual time on the voting block. Is that agreed? Agreed.